They fired me for asking one day off. Not a week, not a leave of absence. Just one quiet request submitted the way I had done everything for 13 years, carefully, correctly, without making noise. And somehow that was enough to erase me. I didn't know it yet, sitting there with the paper still warm in my hands, but that single decision, small, efficient, completely justified in their eyes, would unravel something much larger than my job. By the time they understood it, the damage wouldn't be loud. It would be precise. My name is Zinnia Blake. For 13 years, I worked behind the parts of the company no one liked to talk about, scheduling payroll coordination shift coverage for more than 120 employees. I wasn't the face of anything. I was the system behind it. The one who made sure operations didn't stall, numbers aligned, and problems disappeared before they became visible. If something broke, it reached me before it reached anyone else. And I fixed it. Quietly, consistently, without needing credit. 3 days before I was fired, I submitted a request for one day off. It followed policy. It was within my balance. It didn't disrupt coverage. I made sure of that. It was denied in under an hour. The meeting invitation came the next morning. No subject line, no explanation, just a time. By the time I walked into that room, everyone was already seated. HR didn't look up when she began reading. Derek Halverson, the new COO, the kind of man who believed pressure made people sharper, watched me like this was a lesson he had already decided I needed. Zinnia Blake, HR, said, voice even almost rehearsed. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. 13 years ended in a sentence. I was still holding the request form when Derek finally spoke. If one day off breaks your commitment, he said, calm, certain, maybe you're the bottleneck. No one moved. No one disagreed. I didn't argue. All right, I said. HR slid another paper toward me. Your system access will remain active until the end of the day for transition. Of course it would. They needed everything to stay smooth after I was gone. So I nodded, sat down one last time, and opened my laptop. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I sent one email. Not to Derek, not to HR. And by the time I walked out of that building, it was already in the hands of the Department of Labor Compliance Unit. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe. Because your support doesn't just grow the channel, it helps meaningful stories like this reach someone who might need them most. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? This is a fictional story, enhanced with the help of AI, to make every detail more vivid and engaging. I hope it leaves a lasting impression and gives you a truly authentic experience. Now, let's continue and see what happens next. For 13 years, I learned how to disappear inside the system. Not vanish, exactly, just become the part no one notices until it stops working. Every broken schedule, every late shift, every last-minute call ran through me, because the automated system failed more often than anyone admitted. So I built my own quiet layer on top of it. Manual adjustments, spreadsheets, notes no one asked for. Emails stacked up like evidence. Can you just adjust this, round that down? Fix it quietly? Overtime didn't disappear by accident. It was shaved, trimmed, corrected into something that fit the budget. I tracked all of it. Timestamps, shift logs, payroll discrepancies. Not because I planned anything, but because something about it felt wrong. Then Derek arrived. 8 months new, title sharp suits, sharper numbers. He called it optimization. Labor costs dropped. His bonus climbed 22%. If it's not documented, it didn't happen, he said once, like it was a rule of nature. I remember smiling at that. Not because it was funny, but because I knew something he didn't. Every adjustment he praised, every saving he celebrated, it all depended on records someone else had kept. Me. What Derek never realized was that the company's official guideline on accurate time tracking, the one compliance kept quoting, I wrote it. And I kept the real version too. The one that showed what actually happened when numbers were adjusted to look clean. By the time I left, the pain had settled into something colder, clearer. I wasn't angry anymore. I was paying attention to everything they thought no one was tracking. I didn't go home angry. That would have been easier. Anger burns fast, loud, and useless. What I needed was clarity. So I sat down at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and began to reconstruct everything. No rush, no hesitation, just work. 7 years of records unfolded in front of me, files I had built quietly alongside the company's official systems. Shift logs, time-stamped emails, payroll adjustments. The pattern wasn't hidden. It had never been hidden. It was just normalized. I started counting. 18,000 hours of overtime that never made it into final payroll. I ran the numbers twice. Roughly $2.4 million in unpaid wages. Not estimates, not guesses. Documented discrepancies tied to specific employees, specific dates, specific approvals. I didn't feel shocked. I felt confirmed. The next step wasn't emotion, it was alignment. I pulled up the Fair Labor Standards Act and began matching each category. Overtime, eligibility, record-keeping requirements, employer obligations, line by line, violation by violation. They hadn't made a mistake. They had built a system. Adjust here, round there, delay approval, shift hours across reporting periods. Small changes repeated thousands of times until the difference became invisible. Except it wasn't invisible to me. I compiled everything into a structured report, clean, verifiable. No exaggeration, no commentary, just facts that could stand on their own. Then I added the final piece. My request for 1 day off. Submitted properly, denied without justification, followed by immediate termination. On its own, it looked small, personal, irrelevant, but placed against 7 years of denied leave patterns, forced overtime, and altered records, it became something else. Proof. Not just of unpaid wages, but of a system that depended on employees never stepping away long enough to question it. I attached the document to my original submission. No explanation, no accusation. By the time I pressed send, everything was aligned data law and timing. They thought they fired me over 1 day. They didn't realize that 1 day completed the entire case. The investigation didn't arrive with sirens. It started quietly, the way most real things do, unnoticed, until it's already moving. I didn't wait for updates. I built my own confirmation. Over the next few days, I reached out to 6 former coworkers. Not the loud ones. Not the ones who complained. The careful ones. The ones who stayed late, covered shifts, trusted the system because they had to. I kept it simple. Check your pay stubs, carefully. No accusations, no explanations. Just a suggestion. At first, the responses were slow, hesitant. Then the numbers started coming back. $8,200 missing over 3 years. $11,000 across 4. Smaller gaps too, hundreds here, a few thousand there. Nothing dramatic on its own. But all of it followed the same pattern I had already mapped. Adjusted hours, rounded overtime, delayed entries that never fully returned. No one had noticed because no one had time to. That was the system's design. The more I saw, the clearer it became. This wasn't random error. It was consistency. Predictable, repeatable, defensible on the surface, and completely wrong underneath. I didn't push them, didn't tell them what to do next. I didn't need to. Once someone sees a number that doesn't belong to them, they don't unsee it. The messages changed. Is this even legal? Should I report this? I thought I just miscalculated. That was the moment the pattern stopped being mine alone. It spread. Quietly. Naturally. Like it had been waiting. Then one message came in that made everything sharper. I'm still here, it said. And it's still happening. I paused on that one. Active employee. Current data. Live system. That changed the weight of everything. This wasn't just history anymore. It was ongoing. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to rush. Because now the pattern wasn't just proven, it was current. And somewhere inside that building, the system was still doing exactly what it had always done, assuming no one was watching. If you think I handled this the right way by staying calm, gathering real proof, and letting people uncover the truth themselves, leave a 1 in the comments. Sometimes the strongest move isn't fighting louder. It's making the facts impossible to ignore. The first crack didn't sound like a collapse. It sounded like a request. A formal notice from the Department of Labor landed in their inboxes, asking for internal records, time logs, payroll data. Routine language, nothing dramatic. But inside that building, it changed the air. I heard about it the same way I heard everything now, through careful, delayed messages from people who suddenly realized the system might not be as stable as it looked. Derek's response came quickly. We comply with all labor laws. Confident, public, controlled. That was the version meant to hold the surface together. Underneath, things shifted. HR didn't panic, not openly. But they started pulling files earlier than usual, asking questions they should have asked years ago. Finance began reviewing historical payroll reports, cross-checking numbers that had never been questioned before. The pattern didn't take long to show itself. It rarely does when someone is finally looking for it. Then someone found the email. Short, direct, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Adjust OT entries to maintain budget target. Sent by a mid-level manager, not Derek, not HR. Just far enough down the chain to seem harmless, but high enough to affect everything. That's how systems protect themselves. Distributed responsibility. Shared silence. But now the email had context. And context changes everything. Derek didn't ignore it. He couldn't. Instead, he shifted tone. Quiet meetings, smaller circles. Questions that sounded like strategy but felt like suspicion. Where did this come from? Who has access to this data? The word leak started appearing in conversations. Not loudly, not officially, just enough. I could almost see the moment it happened, the realization that this wasn't random, that someone had connected the dots. What Derek didn't know was that the email hadn't been discovered by chance. It had been preserved, stored, indexed, and quietly backed up inside the internal archive system I had maintained for years. The same system no one thought about. The same system no one checked. The same system that long before I walked out had already forwarded everything that mattered. The audit didn't feel like an investigation. It felt like pressure applied slowly, evenly, until something cracked. This time, it was official. The Department of Labor escalated the request into a full audit. Not a question anymore, an obligation. They wanted everything. Complete time logs. Payroll records covering 7 full years. Documentation that proved every hour worked had been properly recorded and paid. That's where the problem began. Because the company didn't have it, not in any way that could survive scrutiny. What they had were fragments, partial exports, adjusted summaries, clean reports that looked consistent until someone compared them against raw entries that no longer existed. I knew exactly what they would find, because I had already seen it, and I had kept it. While they scrambled internally, I stayed silent. No statements, no social posts, no interviews. There was nothing to add. The facts were already moving on their own. Inside the company, the tone shifted fast. Deadlines tightened, meetings stacked. Finance was asked to reconstruct data that had never been preserved. HR began documenting conversations that should have been documented years ago. Derek didn't stay quiet. He couldn't. Instead, he pushed back. Privately at first, then more directly. She's a disgruntled ex-employee, he said in one call, that made its way back to me. We're considering legal action. It was a familiar strategy. Discredit the source. Question the motive. Create just enough doubt to slow things down. But doubt only works when there isn't clarity. And this time, there was too much of it. The audit team wasn't building a case from scratch. They weren't guessing. They weren't relying on internal records alone. They already had what they needed. Every discrepancy, every adjustment, every missing hour tied to a name, a date, and a decision, submitted before the audit ever began. By the time Derek realized the scope of it, the process was already beyond his control. This wasn't a situation he could manage. It was a system that had already been exposed, and the pressure he thought he could contain was no longer inside the company. It was closing in from the outside. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It started with a conclusion no one could spin. The preliminary findings came back faster than anyone expected. Clear language, no ambiguity. The company had engaged in systematic violations of overtime laws. Hours were altered. Payments were withheld. Records were incomplete, in ways that pointed to intent, not error. That was the moment the system stopped pretending to function. Internally, the numbers circulated first in whispers, then in meetings, then in a document no one could ignore. $3.1 million. Liabilities, back wages, penalties. Not a projection, not a worst-case scenario. A calculated exposure. The board called an emergency session before the day ended. Executives who had ignored payroll reports for years suddenly needed full briefings. Legal teams were pulled in. Risk assessments updated in real time. And in the middle of it, Derek tried to hold the line. "We can settle this quietly," he said according to someone who was in the room. "Control the narrative. Limit the damage." It sounded reasonable. If this had been contained. But it wasn't. Because by the time the board started asking questions, the story had already moved beyond internal damage control. Employees were talking. Not loudly, not publicly, but enough. Comparing numbers, matching discrepancies, realizing they weren't isolated cases. That's when the shift became irreversible. One of them filed a formal class action complaint representing not just one missing paycheck, but years of underpayment across multiple departments. That changed everything. A regulatory issue can be negotiated. A collective legal action cannot be quietly erased. The company wasn't just facing penalties anymore. It was facing a unified claim from the very people it depended on to operate. The narrative Derek wanted to control no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the record. And the record was no longer internal. It was public, structured, and growing. By the end of the week, the question wasn't whether the company had failed. It was how far the consequences would reach. The confrontation came later than I expected, and quieter than Derek would have preferred. He didn't call it a meeting, just a request, neutral location. No lawyers present, at least not visibly. The kind of setup designed to make everything feel reasonable, contained. I agreed. Not because I needed anything from him, but because I wanted to see how he would frame it now that control had slipped. Derek looked different in person, less polished, still composed, but there was a tension underneath, like something he couldn't quite manage anymore. "You could have come to me," he said, skipping introductions. I held his gaze. "I did," I replied. 13 years. That landed harder than anything louder would have. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he adjusted, shifting back into strategy. "We can resolve this," he said. "Privately. There are options, compensation, terms. You don't need to be part of what this is becoming. Part of what this is becoming." That was his language for it now. I let the silence stretch just long enough. "This was never about me," I said. That was the part he didn't understand. Still didn't. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You started this." I shook my head. "No," I said calmly. "I documented it." "There's a difference." His jaw tightened. Not anger exactly. Frustration. The kind that comes when the usual lever's authority pressure negotiations stop working. "You're exposing the company," he said. I didn't correct him. He was finally seeing it clearly, just not completely. Because what he still didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to check, was the structure of the case itself. I wasn't the primary claimant. I wasn't the face of it. I wasn't even listed in the first filing. The lawsuit had already moved beyond me, carried forward by people whose names he didn't recognize, whose records he had never reviewed. By the time he realized that there was nothing left to negotiate, he hadn't lost control in that room. He had lost it long before he ever asked to meet me. The fallout didn't feel loud. It felt final. By the time the case reached its conclusion, there was no dramatic courtroom moment, no single announcement that changed everything. Just a series of documents, rulings, and agreements that closed every door the company once relied on to protect itself. The outcome was clear. They were required to pay every hour of unpaid overtime going back 7 years. Not estimates. Not negotiated reductions. Full compensation calculated employee by employee, backed by verified records. On top of that came the penalties, fines layered onto liability and mandatory legal oversight that ensured every future payroll decision would be monitored, audited, and documented in ways they had avoided for years. The system didn't just break, it was replaced. Derek didn't survive it. The official statement said he stepped down. The timing said everything else. His strategies, his decisions, his confidence in cutting labor costs without consequence, all of it traced back through the findings. HR leadership was replaced within weeks. Policies rewritten. Processes rebuilt under supervision. And then the payments began. One by one, people received what they should have been paid all along. Deposits that didn't feel like bonuses or settlements, but corrections. I heard from a few of them. Short messages, no drama, just clarity. I thought I was crazy. Turns out I was just unpaid. That line stayed with me, because that was the real damage. Not just the money, but the doubt they had learned to carry. And now it was gone. What surprised most people, if they noticed at all, was what didn't appear in any of the official records. No mention of how it started. No mention of who connected the pattern. My name wasn't there, not in the filings, not in the summaries, not in the outcome. The system had been corrected. The accountability had been assigned. And I remained exactly where I had always been. Behind it. The next chapter didn't begin with noise. It began with quiet work. I didn't celebrate what happened. There was nothing to celebrate. What mattered was that the system had been corrected and people had been paid what they were owed. That was enough. I started my new role a few weeks later. Compliance consultant. Different company. Different structure. Same underlying problem, just hidden in different ways. That's what I had learned. These systems don't fail loudly. They drift slowly until someone decides to look closely. That's what I do now. I don't fix schedules anymore. I don't adjust payroll. I don't stay late to cover gaps no one acknowledges. Instead, I review processes, audit records, and ask the questions most companies hope no one asks. Where are the hours going? Who approved this adjustment? What happens when someone finally checks? Most of the time, the answers come quickly once the right questions are asked, and sometimes they don't. That's when things start to change. A few months into the job, I received an email from someone I recognized. Short, direct. Thank you. I paid off my debt. No details. No explanation needed. I read it once, then again. Not for validation. Just to confirm that something real had come out of everything. I replied with a single line. Keep your records, because that's where it starts. Not with confrontation, not with anger, with proof that no one expects you to keep. The rest follows. I closed my laptop and moved on to the next case. Another company, another system, another quiet set of numbers waiting to be understood. They fired me for one day off. It cost them 7 years. What stayed with me wasn't the money or even the outcome. It was how easy it had been for something wrong to feel normal for so long. Small adjustments, quiet approvals, numbers that almost looked right. No one questioned it because no one had the time or the proof. And that's the part that matters most. Truth doesn't need to be loud, but it does need to be recorded. If you were in my position, would you have spoken up? Or would you have convinced yourself it wasn't your place? There's no perfect answer. But there is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, where you decide whether to look closer or look away. For me, it started with keeping track. If this story made you think differently, even for a second, then you're already part of something bigger than this video. A simple, like a comment or a subscription, doesn't just support a channel. It helps stories like this reach someone who might need the reminder that fairness is worth protecting. And sometimes the right action from one person can quietly change everything for many others. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.